Hello everybody, I'm Jeremy Dickinson. I thank you all for watching. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Philosophy Clips. In this philosophy clip, I'll be talking about Ross's value theory. I'll be talking about Rossian value pluralism in particular. This is part 3 of my video series on Ross's moral system. In part 1, I talked about Ross's just big picture general moral system, his thoroughgoing pluralism, his thoroughgoing moral pluralism. In part 2, I talked about Ross's prima facie duties. I talked about his normative pluralism. And here in part 3, I'm going to turn to his value theory and talk about his value pluralism. So we know that Ross, he develops a thoroughgoing moral pluralism. So before I get to Ross's value theory and get to his value pluralism, let me see if I can say a few just recapping words about Ross's normative system. So with Ross's normative system, remember, we're given 7 principles, prima facie duties, and these principles are taken by Ross to be equally fundamental. They're axiomatic, meaning they're not derived from any other principle. None of the principles that he provides us, none of the duties that he provides us in his system reduce to any of the others in that way. So that's what it means that they're all equally fundamental. They hold, kind of like rules of thumb hold. They hold generally, but not always. So in this way, they can admit of exceptions. And this, even though Ross, he's in the tradition of Kant in the sense that they're both duty-based ethicists, duty-based moral philosophers, Ross breaks from Kant in that Ross thinks that the fundamental moral principles are prima facie, not categorical. For Kant, we saw that the categorical imperatives, the moral imperatives, they're exceptionless. And Ross disagreed with Kant on that front. We also saw that Ross thought that these prima facie duties weren't able to be put into a rigorous system of lexical prioritizing. We saw some cases that showed that if we did that, then we'd end up with wrong verdicts in some cases. Ross thinks that what we need to do is we need to exercise moral judgment. In applying the prima facie duties, we look at the particular morally relevant features of a circumstance or the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and then we apply the prima facie duties accordingly. So that's just a bit of recapping of Ross's normative system. Let's turn to Ross's value theory system. So we recall that a value theory provides us with a system of intrinsically good things. It tells us what things are intrinsically valuable. Now, of course, in a completed moral philosophy, you're going to want to say something about how the value theory and the normative theory are related. Let's just isolate the value theory for our purposes right now. So Ross, he's part of a long-standing tradition that thinks that when we do a value theory, we work out an account of the intrinsically good things. He's also part of a tradition that thinks that there are intrinsically good things. There are debates here about whether or not there are such things in the first place. But Ross, he by and large agrees with the Aristotelian tradition, which says that, gosh, if there's goodness at all, then there has to be intrinsic goodness. Why? Well, because big picture, there are 2 kinds of good things. There are those things that are intrinsically good, it seems, and there are those things that are extrinsically good, those things that get their goodness from other things. So if there aren't any intrinsically good things, well, it's trivial, there aren't any intrinsically good things, but it's also going to be the case, here's what Aristotle would argue, and those who follow in the Aristotelian tradition here would argue, there aren't any extrinsically good things either, because the extrinsically good things, they get their good things from something external to them, right? They require the intrinsically good things in order to be good in the first place. So there wouldn't be extrinsically good things either. There wouldn't be any goodness at all. So Ross is part of this tradition, this long-standing tradition in the history of philosophy that says that if there is goodness at all, there'd have to be intrinsically good things, or at least one intrinsically good thing. Now, if you go monistic with respect to your value theory, you're saying that all goodness reduces to one thing. So all those things that are extrinsically good, they get their goodness from the one intrinsically good thing that there is. Ross thought that a monistic system like that developed by, say, the traditional utilitarians, that they argue that the one intrinsically good thing is happiness. It's overly reductionistic. Ordinary moral thinking tells us that happiness, for example, isn't the only thing that is good, the only thing that's intrinsically good, the only thing that's worth pursuing for its own sake. That's another way of understanding what an intrinsically good thing is. It's something that's worth pursuing, as it were, for its own sake. And what Ross wants to say is just ordinary moral reflection. What else do we have? Is going to reveal to us that there are things that are worth pursuing for their own sake besides happiness. And so Ross wants to give us, surprise, surprise, a non-monistic, that is a pluralistic value system, which identifies more than one thing as intrinsically good. And so we're going to have a system of 4 things that Ross gives us. He didn't intend this to be exhaustive, but we have a set of 4 intrinsically good things that can account for all of goodness. So think about like what one's doing when one does a value theory. One is in effect trying to account for all of goodness, just like as what one's doing in one's normative theory involves trying to account for all of rightness. One is in one's value theory accounting for all of goodness. And Ross wants to say, just like he said with respect to normative theory, that goodness is various and varied. And so we need a robust set of goods in order to account for all of goodness. Okay, so I've hopefully set up enough there for understanding some of the basics of Ross's value theory. You see how he's connected to what I like to call the Aristotelian tradition in thinking about value theory that's been long-standing. Those of you know Aristotle was writing a long time ago in the ancient period, okay, 4th century, BCE, roughly. So the 4 goods that Ross gives us, again, not intended to be exhaustive. I don't take much of what Ross developed in his moral system to be understood as an exhaustive system. He did think that it needed to be improved upon and fixed and all the rest. You might take that to be a virtue of Ross's system. So he took virtue to be intrinsically good. Okay, so perhaps that involves virtuous states of being, virtuous character states and the like, virtuous dispositions. Those things are intrinsically valuable. So here we're thinking perhaps about being, wise and courageous, being temperate or moderate, okay, being prudent. These are some of the classical, traditional, or being just, traditional virtues. These are called the classical virtues. But he also thought that states of knowledge were valuable. So states of knowledge were intrinsically valuable, worth pursuing. He also thought that pleasant states were valuable, but he also thought that pleasant states, in proportion to the amount of virtue, were valuable. Okay, so he thought that that there was something intuitive about the fact that the person who's virtuous deserves more pleasure than the person who's not. Okay, a kind of view of justice there in place. So we've got virtuous states, we have knowledge states, we have pleasure or pleasant states, and then we have states of pleasure, pleasant states in proportion to the degree to which an individual is virtuous. All of those 4 count as intrinsically valuable. Again, it's not meant to be exhaustive, but those 4 are the big 4 in Ross's system. None of these are reducible to any of the others on the list. Just like with the prima facie duties, these are going to be equally fundamentally, equally intrinsically good things. Okay, so Ross, as I've noted several times in this video series on him, he does appeal to ordinary moral thinking quite a bit. But he also gives arguments, and he gives arguments here. In fact, he gives a very famous argument for thinking that there's more than one thing that belongs to the set of intrinsically good things. And so what I want to do in the remainder of this video is try to understand this argument, this very intuitively compelling argument. And the argument is a kind of isolation test, as we're going to see. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to compare 2 worlds, 2 possible worlds, if I can put it that way. And by comparing these worlds with each other and rendering judgments on about these worlds, we're going to, according to Ross, be able to derive, as it were, a system of intrinsically good things beyond a monistic system. So the first thing to note before, as we start to dive into the argument, this test that we're going to get, this isolation test that we're going to get from Ross, is that Ross is fine saying that pleasant experiences, right? That's gonna, like, pleasant experiences is like, those are gonna belong, right, on the list of intrinsically good things. Okay, so the hedonistic utilitarians, on Ross's view, they were onto something. So pleasure is intrinsically good. We'll put that on the list. Not too much debate there. Many philosophers will put that there. We'll put pleasure on their list of intrinsically good things. But now we need to add to pleasure to get to the set of four things that Ross has on his list. And so how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to compare worlds, compare possible worlds. We'll call them world 1 and world 2 respectively, just for ease of discussing them. So imagine in world 1 and world 2, we have equal levels of pleasure. So remember, pleasure is taken for granted to be intrinsically good. We put them in our worlds, and in world 1 and world 2, we have equal levels of pleasure. And let's just simplify things. When we do all the calculating and weighing, we see that they're equivalent in terms of their pleasure levels. They're both at plus 1,000. Plus 1,000. Okay, all things being equal. Okay, just to simplify here. So that plus 1,000. Right, and now what we're going to do is when we think about world 1, we're going to imagine in world 1 that when we look at all the virtue in that world, we're going to see that there are, I don't know, plus 200 levels of virtue, supposing we can quantify such things. So work with me and work with Ross on understanding what's going on here. And then we look at world 2, and we notice that it's full of viciousness, the opposite of virtue, of being virtuous. So it's filled with viciousness. So it's actually in the negatives. It's negative, 1,000, let's say. And we ask ourselves now, okay, we have a world where there's positive levels of virtue, world 1, and in world 2 we have negative levels. We say there's no virtue there at all. And here's what we can ask then. Let's compare these worlds with each other. Which world is better? What's the verdict that you arrive at in reflection and thinking about it? And Ross says, of course you're going to say that world 1 is better. And what's the explanation for it? The only difference between these worlds is the virtue levels. That's right. So what's accounting for the betterness, as it were, of world 1 compared to world 2 is virtue. So we got to add virtue to the list. So virtue is intrinsically good. Okay? Now, what about the next intrinsically good thing? So now we take world 1 and world 2, and we run similar kind of isolation tests where we compare them with each other. So now you take knowledge, right? And with world 1, everything is going to be the same about these worlds except for in world 1, when we look at all the knowledge facts and we do all of that knowledge weighing, supposing we could do such a thing, we end up with plus 1,000. But suppose in world 2, they're still in the dark ages in their thinking. Right? There's there's no knowledge there. I was going to say very little, but suppose there's no knowledge there. Okay, they have a bunch of beliefs, but they're still in the dark ages and they're thinking about things. So they're really in the negatives. They're quite ignorant there. Okay, world 1 and world 2. You have the knowledge world, the anti-knowledge world. I'm going to ask you, which world's better? And you're going to say, world 1, where there's knowledge. Of course. So here's what Ross says. Knowledge is intrinsically good. So now we've got knowledge is intrinsically good. But now what about pleasure in proportion to virtue levels? Now imagine world 1 and world 2. Isn't this fun? Very imaginative exercise here. Imagine world 1 and world 2. They're equal in all respects, okay, other than the following. In world 1, people are rewarded for being virtuous. In world 2, the wicked are rewarded. The vicious are rewarded. The vicious go around and prey on those who are virtuous and beat them down regularly. Which world's better? Supposing we can do some quantification here, right, in terms of pleasure in proportion to virtue, right? What Ross is going to say pretty intuitively, right? No matter what value you put over here, you're going to have a negative value over here. In world 2, world 1's going to have a positive value. Which world's better? You're going to say, oh yeah, the world where the virtuous are rewarded, of course. So then we've got to add that. So rewarded by pleasure, we could say. So we're going to add pleasure in proportion to virtue as one of the intrinsic goods. So we've got 4 things that are intrinsically good, and that's how Ross is going to account for his system of intrinsically good things. Hopefully this is all clear. If you have any questions, be sure to comment below and let me know. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.